General Blackwood had already decided she didn't belong here before Lieutenant Colonel Reyna Castellanos even stepped through the briefing room door. His pointed glance at the duty roster and slow shake of his head made that clear to the 12 senior officers already seated around the polished mahogany table. "She's not ready for this level of operation," he muttered to Colonel Hayes, loud enough for the room to hear. Pentagon's pushing diversity quotas again. The morning sun streamed through tall windows of the Pentagon's secure briefing facility, casting sharp shadows across classified documents that would determine the fate of a critical Middle Eastern operation. Castellanos moved with measured precision toward the empty chair at the far end of the table, her dress blues immaculate despite the early hour. Every eye in the room tracked her movement, and she could feel the weight of their collective skepticism settling like a heavy blanket over her shoulders. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar situations where someone was underestimated in your community. Major Thompson leaned toward General Morrison and whispered, "Think she's ever seen real combat?" Morrison's response came as a barely audible snort. "Paper pusher from logistics, most likely. Never been outside the wire." The soft murmur of similar conversations rippled around the table as she took her seat, each comment a small cut designed to establish the hierarchy before any official words were spoken. General Blackwood called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of his knuckles against the table. "Today we're discussing Operation Desert Falcon, a high-stakes extraction in hostile territory." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Castellanos. "This mission requires seasoned combat veterans with proven track records in special operations." His emphasis on the word proven carried unmistakable implications. The mission briefing unfolded with clinical precision. Intelligence suggested a captured American journalist was being held in a compound 30 miles outside Fallujah. The extraction would require coordination between multiple special forces units, precision timing, and someone with intimate knowledge of the region's tribal dynamics. As each detail emerged, Castellanos noticed the subtle glances in her direction, the raised eyebrows that questioned her presence at this particular table. Colonel Hayes cleared his throat and addressed the room. "We need someone to liaison with the local tribal leaders. Someone who speaks the language and understands the cultural nuances." His tone suggested he already knew the answer, and it wasn't the woman sitting at the end of the table. "We can't afford any diplomatic missteps that might compromise the operation." General Blackwood nodded approvingly. "Exactly my thoughts." He turned toward Castellanos with what might have been a polite smile, if not for the ice in his eyes. "Lieutenant Colonel, I'm sure you understand this operation requires personnel with specific qualifications. Perhaps you'd be more valuable coordinating logistics from here at the Pentagon." It was phrased as a suggestion, but everyone in the room recognized it as a dismissal wrapped in diplomatic language. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. 12 pairs of eyes waited for her response, most expecting graceful acceptance of the implied relegation to support duties. The clock on the wall ticked audibly in the quiet room, marking seconds that felt like hours as the weight of institutional expectation pressed against her shoulders. Castellanos straightened in her chair, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "General, I appreciate your concern about qualifications." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "I've spent the last 8 years working directly with tribal leaders throughout Afghanistan and Iraq. I speak fluent Arabic and Pashto, and I've successfully negotiated the release of 17 capture personnel during my previous deployments." The temperature in the room seemed to shift imperceptibly. General Blackwood's confident expression flickered for just a moment, replaced by something that might have been surprise. Colonel Hayes stopped his casual document shuffling and looked up sharply. Major Thompson's whispered conversations ceased entirely as her words registered with unmistakable clarity. But it was too late for the room's dynamics to change completely. The initial judgment had been cast, and momentum in military hierarchies was difficult to reverse once established. General Blackwood recovered quickly, his skeptical expression returning like a mask sliding back into place. That's interesting background, Lieutenant Colonel. However, this particular operation requires someone with extensive special operations experience. Combat experience, not diplomatic meetings in secure compounds. The dismissal hung in the air like smoke, and Castellanos could feel the room's collective assumption that the conversation was over. She had been acknowledged, minimally credited, and then politely but firmly excluded from the real decision-making. It was a familiar dance she'd witnessed countless times throughout her career, the subtle choreography of institutional bias dressed up as operational necessity. Outside the briefing room windows, the Virginia morning continued its steady progression toward full daylight, indifferent to the human dynamics playing out in the secure facility. The mission would proceed with or without her input, just as similar operations had proceeded for years without acknowledging certain capabilities that didn't fit traditional expectations. But what none of the men in that room yet understood was that some phone calls were already being made, and some decisions had already been set in motion far above their current pay grades. The secure phone on General Blackwood's desk remained silent for another 20 minutes while the briefing continued without Castellanos. She had been politely excused after his final dismissal, her departure noted by a few satisfied nods from the assembled officers. Colonel Hayes was already sketching preliminary timelines on the whiteboard when the distinctive double ring of a classified line cut through the discussion like a blade. Blackwood frowned at the interruption, his hand hesitating over the receiver. Priority calls during active briefings were rare, typically reserved for emergencies or communications from the highest levels of command. The room fell silent as he lifted the handset, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to sharp attention within seconds. "This is General Blackwood." His voice carried the crisp authority of a man accustomed to control, but those watching closely noticed the subtle change in his posture as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Yes, sir. I understand." His eyes moved involuntarily toward the door through which Castellanos had exited moments earlier. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but the silence it created stretched much longer. Blackwood's responses became increasingly monosyllabic as the call progressed. "Yes, sir." "No, sir. I was not aware of that, sir." "Understood completely, sir." When he finally replaced the handset, his face had taken on the carefully neutral expression of a man who had just received orders that challenged his previous assumptions. Colonel Hayes ventured the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, is there a problem with the operation?" The concern in his voice reflected the room's collective worry that their carefully planned mission might be facing unexpected complications from higher command levels. Blackwood stood slowly, his movements deliberate as he processed the implications of what he'd just heard. "Gentlemen, we need to recall Lieutenant Colonel Castellanos immediately." The words came out measured and precise, but underneath lay something that sounded remarkably like controlled surprise. It appears there are aspects of her background that weren't included in the standard briefing materials. Major Thompson exchanged confused glances with General Morrison. "What kind of aspects, sir?" The question carried an undercurrent of skepticism, as if the very notion of relevant hidden qualifications seemed impossible given their previous assessment of her capabilities. Before Blackwood could respond, his aide knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Castellanos is still in the building. She's in conference room, C, reviewing regional intelligence reports." The aide's efficiency in locating her suggested this wasn't a casual inquiry, but rather urgent business that needed immediate resolution. "Have her return here immediately," Blackwood ordered, his tone carrying a gravity that hadn't been present during the earlier dismissal. "And bring her complete service record. Not the summary version we reviewed this morning. Everything." The aide departed quickly, leaving behind a room full of senior officers trying to decipher what had just shifted so dramatically. The confidence that had characterized their earlier assessment of Castellanos seemed to evaporate, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they might have been operating with incomplete information. Military careers were built on thorough intelligence, and the possibility that they had misjudged a crucial element felt deeply unsettling. When Castellanos returned 5 minutes later, the atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Where before she had faced polite but firm dismissal, now she encountered careful attention and something that resembled wariness. Blackwood gestured toward her previous seat with considerably more deference than he had shown during their earlier interaction. "Lieutenant Colonel, please take your seat." He paused, consulting notes he'd hastily scribbled during the phone call. "It seems we may have been working with incomplete information about your qualifications for this mission." His admission carried the weight of a man unaccustomed to acknowledging oversights, particularly in front of subordinates who had witnessed his earlier certainty. Castellanos settled into her chair with the same measured precision as before, but now the room's attention felt different. Instead of skeptical evaluation, she sensed urgent reassessment. The same officers who had whispered doubts about her combat experience now studied her with new intensity, looking for clues they might have missed during their initial dismissal. The complete service record arrived moments later, delivered by two aides carrying folders that seemed considerably thicker than the summary documents they had reviewed that morning. Blackwood opened the first folder and began reading, his expression shifting almost immediately from professional neutrality to something approaching astonishment. Colonel Hayes leaned forward slightly. "Sir, what exactly are we looking at?" His question reflected the growing tension in the room as the other officers tried to understand what information could have prompted such a dramatic reversal in their mission planning. Blackwood continued reading, occasionally glancing up at Castellanos as if seeing her for the first time. "According to this, Lieutenant Colonel Castellanos has been involved in some of the most classified special operations of the past decade." He turned a page, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Operations that apparently required clearance levels above what most of us possess." The revelation settled over the room like a slow-moving fog. The woman they had dismissed as a logistics officer with diplomatic experience was apparently something else entirely. Major Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recalculating everything he thought he knew about the person sitting at the end of the table. General Morrison cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, what kind of operations are we talking about?" His question carried the weight of a man beginning to understand that his earlier assessments might have been not just wrong, but dramatically uninformed. Blackwood looked directly at Castellanos, his expression now carrying a mixture of respect and curiosity that had been completely absent from their earlier interaction. "Lieutenant Colonel, perhaps you could enlighten us about your actual role in recent Middle Eastern operations. Because according to this documentation, your involvement goes considerably beyond cultural liaison work." Castellanos remained perfectly still as 12 pairs of eyes focused on her with newfound intensity. The casual dismissal from 30 minutes earlier had been replaced by something approaching reverence, though she could see the confusion still etched in their faces. These men were accustomed to having complete information before making decisions, and the realization that they had been operating blind clearly unsettled them. "For the past 8 years, I've been part of Task Force Amber," she began, her voice carrying the same steady tone she had maintained throughout the morning. The room's collective intake of breath was audible. Task Force Amber was legendary in special operations circles, a unit so classified that most personnel knew it only through whispered rumors and redacted after-action reports. General Blackwood set down the folder he'd been reading, his earlier skepticism now completely absent. "Task Force Amber conducts deep infiltration operations in denied territory," he said slowly, as if testing his own understanding. "Single operators placed behind enemy lines for extended periods without support or extraction options." "Exactly," Castellanos confirmed. "My cover for the past decade has been cultural liaison and diplomatic coordination. It provided perfect justification for extensive travel throughout Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. While officially facilitating meetings between coalition forces and tribal leaders, I was gathering intelligence on high-value targets and establishing networks for future operations." Colonel Hayes leaned back in his chair, clearly recalibrating everything he thought he knew about special operations personnel. So when you mentioned negotiating the release of 17 captured personnel, he said carefully, those weren't diplomatic negotiations in secure compounds. They were solo infiltration missions into enemy-controlled territory, she replied matter-of-factly. Each extraction required weeks of preparation, establishing local contacts, and often eliminating hostile forces before securing the targets. The diplomatic cover story was necessary to explain my presence in regions where no American military personnel were supposed to operate. Major Thompson's face had gone pale as the implications sank in. The woman he had dismissed as a paper pusher had apparently been conducting some of the most dangerous missions in the entire theater of operations. How many solo missions? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 47 confirmed deep infiltrations over 8 years, Castellanos answered without hesitation. 31 successful target eliminations, 17 prisoner extractions, and countless intelligence-gathering operations that provided actionable intelligence for conventional forces. The clinical precision of her response suggested these numbers were burned into her memory with the clarity that came from constant debriefing sessions. General Morrison found his voice first among the stunned officers. And the phone call that just came in? Who exactly knows about your actual background? The question carried implications about how high up the chain of command this information reached, and why it was being revealed now. Blackwood glanced at his notes from the phone call, his expression thoughtful. That was the Secretary of Defense himself. Apparently, the National Security Council has been monitoring this briefing, and they felt it was time to read us into Lieutenant Colonel Castellanos' actual qualifications. He paused, allowing the weight of that revelation to settle. The mission we're planning isn't just another extraction. It's being personally overseen at the highest levels of government. The room fell silent as the officers processed this information. Special operations were one thing, but direct oversight from the National Security Council suggested stakes far beyond a simple journalist rescue. Castellanos watched their faces as the reality dawned on them, seeing the exact moment when their casual confidence transformed into something approaching anxiety. Colonel Hayes was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. What exactly is the real nature of this operation? Because if the NSC is involved and we have a task force Amber operator in the room, this isn't about rescuing a journalist, is it? The captured American is actually a deep covert intelligence asset, Castellanos explained, her voice maintaining its professional neutrality. He's been operating in the region for 3 years, gathering intelligence on a terrorist financing network that spans multiple countries. His capture wasn't random. Someone inside the network identified him, which means our entire Middle Eastern intelligence apparatus has been compromised. General Blackwood nodded grimly. And that's why they want you on this mission. You're the only operator with the network contacts and regional knowledge to determine how deep the compromise goes. The rescue is secondary to identifying the leak and neutralizing the security breach. The mission parameters had shifted dramatically in the span of 20 minutes. What began as a straightforward extraction had become a complex counterintelligence operation with implications for national security. The officers who had questioned Castellanos' qualifications now found themselves wondering if they were qualified to be in the same room with her. Major Thompson cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, I apologize for our earlier assessment. We weren't working with complete information." His words carried the weight of institutional embarrassment, the recognition that their professional judgment had been based on incomplete intelligence. Castellanos nodded acknowledgement without any trace of satisfaction. The cover story was designed to be convincing, Major. The whole point of deep cover is that it appears authentic to everyone, including friendly forces. Your assessment was based on the information you had available. But now that we know the real situation, General Morrison interjected, what exactly do you need from us? Because it's becoming clear that this operation is going to be significantly different from what we originally planned. First, we need to understand that this mission has 3 phases. Castellanos began, her tone shifting into operational planning mode. Phase 1 is infiltrating the compound and securing the asset. Phase 2 is extracting actionable intelligence about the network compromise. Phase 3 is the most critical, eliminating the security breach without alerting the terrorist network that we've discovered their penetration of our intelligence apparatus. The complexity of the operation was becoming apparent to everyone in the room. This wasn't just about getting one person out of enemy territory. It was about protecting an entire intelligence network while simultaneously repairing a potentially catastrophic security breach. The stakes had escalated far beyond anything they had anticipated when they walked into the briefing room that morning. The operational planning that followed Castellanos' revelation proceeded with an entirely different dynamic than anyone in the room had anticipated. Where before the officers had been mapping out a mission they assumed they understood, now they found themselves deferring to expertise they hadn't known existed. The transformation was both humbling and unsettling for men accustomed to being the most qualified people in any given room. General Blackwood spread detailed satellite imagery across the conference table, but his earlier authoritative tone had been replaced by something more collaborative. Lieutenant Colonel, based on your field experience in the region, what's your assessment of the compound security? His question carried genuine respect rather than the perfunctory consultation he might have offered an hour earlier. Castellanos studied the photographs with the practiced eye of someone who had analyzed countless similar facilities. The outer perimeter shows standard militant defensive positions, but these internal structures suggest something more sophisticated. She pointed to a series of buildings that appeared unremarkable to the other officers. These aren't typical holding facilities. They're designed for long-term detention and interrogation, which means our asset has likely been compromised for weeks, not days. Colonel Hayes leaned closer to examine the details she was highlighting. How can you tell the difference? The buildings look similar to other compounds we've targeted. His question reflected the learning curve they were all experiencing as they adjusted to working with someone whose expertise far exceeded their previous assumptions. The spacing between structures, the sight lines, the positioning of what appear to be guard posts, she explained patiently. Standard militant compounds are designed for defense against conventional assault. This layout is optimized for preventing escape attempts and maintaining security during extended detention. It suggests they're planning to keep him alive for strategic purposes rather than executing him quickly. Major Thompson studied the imagery with new appreciation for details he'd previously overlooked. That changes our approach significantly, doesn't it? If they're planning long-term detention, they'll have established protocols that make extraction more complicated than a simple raid. Exactly, Castellanos confirmed. But it also creates opportunities. Long-term detention facilities require regular supply runs, shift changes, and communication with external command structures. We can exploit those patterns if we understand their operational rhythm. General Morrison had been quietly reviewing the intelligence files during this exchange, and his expression suggested growing concern about elements beyond the immediate tactical situation. Lieutenant Colonel, you mentioned that someone inside the network identified our asset. Do we have any indication of how extensive this compromise might be? The question touched on the aspect of the mission that made it far more complex than a typical extraction. Castellanos' expression grew more serious as she considered the implications. Based on the timing and method of his capture, the compromise likely extends to our communication protocols and possibly our local network of informants. Anyone who has had contact with our asset in the past 6 months should be considered potentially exposed. The room fell silent as the officers processed the scope of the security breach. Blackwood was the first to voice the obvious concern. That could include dozens of local assets who have been providing intelligence for years. If the network has been feeding information back to terrorist organizations, the damage could be catastrophic, which is why the extraction is only the first phase of this operation, Castellanos continued. Once we secure our asset, we need to determine the extent of the compromise and neutralize the security breach without alerting the network that we've discovered their penetration. It's a delicate balance between gathering intelligence and preventing further damage. Colonel Hayes looked up from the tactical maps he'd been studying. How do we maintain operational security for our own mission if we assume their intelligence network has been compromised. Everything we're planning right now could potentially be known to hostile forces. That's where my cover story becomes critical, she explained. As far as any external observers know, I'm still a cultural liaison officer attending a routine briefing about diplomatic coordination. My presence here appears completely consistent with my official role. The real operational planning will need to happen through channels that bypass normal intelligence networks. The complexity of maintaining multiple levels of deception while planning a critical mission was becoming apparent to everyone in the room. General Blackwood consulted his notes from the phone call with the Secretary of Defense. According to the briefing I received, this operation has been designated special access required. That means compartmentalized planning with minimal documentation and restricted communication protocols. Major Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sir, how many people outside this room know about the real nature of this mission? The question reflected growing awareness that they were now involved in something far beyond their usual scope of operations. Beyond the National Security Council and the Secretary of Defense, very few, Blackwood replied. The operational security requirements mean that even our normal support networks will be operating with limited information. We're essentially planning a mission within a mission, with multiple layers of cover stories and operational deception. General Morrison raised another concern that had been troubling him. If Lieutenant Colonel Castellanos' cover has been maintained for 8 years, what happens to that cover after this mission? Once she's involved in an overt special operations deployment, maintaining her diplomatic facade becomes much more difficult. It's a calculated risk, Castellanos acknowledged. The asset's intelligence value and the need to contain the security breach outweigh the potential compromise of my cover identity. But it does mean this operation represents a significant transition point in my operational capacity. The personal sacrifice implicit in her statement wasn't lost on the assembled officers. She was potentially ending an 8-year deep cover assignment that had provided unprecedented intelligence access, all for the success of this single mission. The weight of that decision spoke to stakes even higher than they had previously understood. Colonel Hayes voiced what everyone was thinking. The fact that you're willing to compromise 8 years of deep cover suggests this security breach represents a threat at the highest levels of national security. We're not just talking about one compromised network, are we? Castellanos met his gaze directly. The compromised network has connections to terrorist financing operations that span 3 continents. If the breach extends to our other intelligence assets in the region, it could compromise ongoing operations against some of the most dangerous terrorist organizations currently operating against American interests. The secure phone rang again 3 hours later, just as the tactical planning session was reaching its most critical phase. Blackwood had been coordinating with Special Operations Command about equipment requirements when a distinctive double ring cut through their detailed discussions about infiltration routes and extraction timelines. This time, however, the interruption carried an urgency that made everyone in the room freeze. Blackwood answered with his usual crisp authority, but his expression shifted within seconds to something approaching alarm. Yes, Mr. Secretary. I understand the timeline has accelerated. He glanced sharply at Castellanos, his face reflecting the kind of concern that came with unexpected changes to carefully laid plans. When did the intelligence come in? The one-sided conversation that followed sent a chill through the assembled officers. Sir, that changes everything about our operational window. Yes, sir, we can adapt, but the risk factors increase significantly. Understood, sir. We'll implement immediately. When he hung up, the silence in the room carried the weight of impending crisis. Gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel, we have a problem, Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a commander facing an impossible timeline. The intelligence networks monitoring our asset situation have detected increased activity around the compound. Our window for extraction has collapsed from 72 hours to less than 18. Colonel Hayes looked up from the equipment manifests he'd been reviewing. Sir, what kind of increased activity are we talking about? The question reflected everyone's need to understand exactly how their carefully constructed plan had just become exponentially more dangerous. According to NSA intercepts, there's been significant communication traffic between the compound and what appears to be a high-level terrorist command structure, Blackwood explained. The intercepts suggest they're planning to move our asset within the next 24 hours. Once he's transferred to a more secure facility, extraction becomes virtually impossible. Castellanos absorbed this information with the calm focus of someone accustomed to rapidly changing operational parameters. Where are they planning to move him? The destination could significantly impact our tactical approach. Her question demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that came from years of adapting to fluid situations in hostile territory. Unknown at this point, but the communication intercepts suggest somewhere deeper into Syrian territory, possibly near the Turkish border, Blackwood replied. Once he's in that region, we lose most of our intelligence networks and support infrastructure. It becomes a completely different type of operation. Major Thompson studied the revised timeline with growing concern. Sir, 18 hours doesn't give us sufficient time for proper reconnaissance or equipment staging. We'd essentially be going in with minimal preparation and limited backup options. His assessment reflected the reality that successful special operations typically required extensive planning and careful coordination. That's exactly the situation we're facing, Blackwood confirmed grimly. The Secretary of Defense made it clear that this operation takes priority over normal operational security protocols. We're authorized to take calculated risks that would normally be considered unacceptable. General Morrison raised the concern that was troubling everyone in the room. What about extraction support? If we're moving this quickly, do we have confirmed assets in place for getting our people out after the mission? The question touched on the critical element that often determined mission success or failure. Castellanos had been studying the intelligence updates while listening to the discussion, and her expression suggested she was already formulating operational modifications. We can use the accelerated timeline to our advantage, she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had adapted to worse situations. The enemy's preparation for moving the asset means they'll be focused on transportation security rather than defending against infiltration. How does that help us? Colonel Hayes asked, genuinely curious about tactical thinking that differed from conventional special operations approaches. If they're planning to move him within 24 hours, they'll have already established transportation protocols and security arrangements, she explained. That creates predictable patterns we can exploit. Instead of infiltrating a static defensive position, we intercept during the transfer when their security posture is focused on movement rather than perimeter defense. The shift in tactical approach was significant, but it also introduced variables that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. General Blackwood consulted the intelligence updates he'd received during the phone call. The intercepts suggest the transfer will happen during early morning hours, probably around dawn. That gives us one opportunity to position ourselves along their route. Major Thompson was already calculating logistical requirements for the modified mission profile. Sir, intercepting a moving convoy requires different equipment and support than infiltrating a static position. We'll need real-time intelligence about their route and timing, plus mobile extraction capabilities. Which brings us back to the fundamental challenge of this operation. Castellanos interjected. We're operating with potentially compromised intelligence networks, which means our information about their movements could be incomplete or deliberately misleading. We need to plan for multiple contingencies. The complexity of the mission was compounding with each new development. What had begun as a challenging but manageable extraction had evolved into a high-risk interception operation with compressed timelines and questionable intelligence. General Morrison voiced what everyone was thinking. Are we sure this operation is still viable given all these complications? The question hung in the air while Blackwood considered the implications. According to the Secretary of Defense, the intelligence value of the asset and the need to contain the security breach make this mission essential regardless of the risk factors. We're authorized to proceed even under less than optimal conditions. Castellanos studied the faces around the table, recognizing the concern and uncertainty that came with rapidly evolving operational parameters. "I've conducted similar intercept operations under comparable timelines," she said quietly. "The key is accepting that we can't control all variables and focusing on the elements we can influence." Her calm assessment provided some reassurance, but it also highlighted the reality that their success would depend heavily on her expertise and experience. Colonel Hayes looked directly at her. "What do you need from us to make this work?" "Because it's becoming clear that your operational knowledge is going to be the deciding factor in mission success. First, we need mobile communications that bypass normal intelligence channels," she replied without hesitation. "Second, we need extraction assets positioned at multiple points along the probable convoy route. Third, we need to accept that this operation will require improvisation based on real-time intelligence rather than detailed pre-planning." The shift from conventional military planning to special operations flexibility was challenging for officers accustomed to detailed preparation and comprehensive backup plans. But as the timeline continued to compress, it was becoming clear that adaptability would matter more than perfect preparation. The equipment staging area in the Pentagon's basement level buzzed with controlled urgency as specialized gear was assembled for an operation that defied conventional military logistics. Castellanos moved through the organized chaos with the practiced efficiency of someone who had improvised similar operations under impossible timelines, while the senior officers watched her preparations with a mixture of admiration and concern. "This isn't standard special operations equipment," Major Thompson observed, studying the collection of gear that Castellanos had requisitioned through channels none of them had known existed. The communications devices, weapons, and tactical equipment bore markings from agencies that operated far outside normal military procurement systems. Task Force Amber operations require equipment that doesn't appear in standard military inventories, Castellanos explained while inspecting a compact satellite communication device. "Most of our gear is designed to be completely deniable if compromised. No serial numbers, no traceable components, and no connections to official U.S. military procurement." Colonel Hayes picked up what appeared to be a standard assault rifle, but closer inspection revealed modifications that spoke to capabilities far beyond normal special operations requirements. "This has been completely customized," he noted with professional appreciation. "The modifications suggest engagement scenarios that go well beyond typical extraction operations. The weapon systems are designed for sustained operations in denied territory, without resupply or maintenance support," she replied, field stripping the rifle with mechanical precision. "Everything has to function perfectly under extreme conditions because there's no backup equipment and no possibility of replacement if something fails." General Blackwood watched the preparation process with growing appreciation for the complexity of deep cover operations. "How long does it typically take to prepare for a mission like this?" His question reflected genuine curiosity about operational standards that existed outside his previous experience. "Under normal circumstances, we'd have weeks of preparation time," Castellanos answered while testing the satellite communication system. "But Task Force Amber operators are trained to deploy with less than 6 hours' notice if necessary. The key is maintaining equipment readiness and intelligence preparation, even when not actively deployed." The phone rang again, and this time General Morrison answered while Blackwood continued supervising the equipment preparation. The conversation was brief, but clearly significant, judging by Morrison's expression when he hung up. "Sir, we have updated intelligence on the convoy route, but there's a complication." "What kind of complication?" Blackwood asked, though his tone suggested he was prepared for additional challenges given the pattern of the day's developments. "The NSA intercepts indicate the convoy will be accompanied by what appears to be a significant security escort," Morrison explained. "Instead of the light protection we anticipated, they're apparently treating this transfer as a high-value asset movement with military-level security." Castellanos paused in her equipment preparation, her expression thoughtful as she processed this new information. "How significant are we talking about?" "The distinction between light security and military escort could completely change the tactical requirements for successful interception. The intercept suggests at least 3 escort vehicles plus the transport vehicle itself, Morrison continued, possibly armed with crew-served weapons and definitely including trained security personnel rather than typical militant fighters. The tactical implications were immediately apparent to everyone in the room. What had been planned as a rapid intercept operation was becoming something closer to a conventional military engagement. Colonel Hayes voiced the obvious concern. That level of security suggests they know we're coming, or at least that they're expecting some kind of rescue attempt. Not necessarily, Castellanos countered, though her tone carried careful consideration rather than dismissal. High-value prisoner transfers often receive enhanced security even without specific threat intelligence. The fact that they're moving him at all suggests they consider him valuable enough to warrant significant protection. Major Thompson studied the updated intelligence reports that had accompanied the phone call. The security escort complicates our extraction timeline significantly, he observed. Even if we successfully intercept the convoy, dealing with military-level resistance could extend the engagement well beyond our planned extraction window. Which brings us to a fundamental decision point, General Blackwood interjected. Do we proceed with the modified mission despite the increased risk factors, or do we recommend postponing until we can establish more favorable conditions? The question carried implications that extended far beyond tactical considerations. Castellanos looked up from the equipment she'd been testing. Based on the intelligence intercepts, postponing isn't really an option, she said quietly. If they're planning to move him deeper into Syrian territory, this represents our last realistic opportunity for extraction. But succeeding against military-level security with an improvised timeline and minimal support represents a significant risk to personnel, Colonel Hayes pointed out. The calculus of acceptable risk versus mission importance was clearly troubling him. That's exactly the kind of calculation that Task Force Amber operators face on every mission, Castellanos replied matter-of-factly. The difference is that we plan for worst-case scenarios and prepare to succeed even when conditions are far from optimal. Her calm confidence in the face of escalating complications provided some reassurance, but it also highlighted the gap between conventional military operations and a specialized world in which she operated. General Morrison raised another concern that had been troubling him. If this operation fails, what are the implications for the broader security breach investigation? Failure means we lose our only direct source of intelligence about the extent of the network compromise, Blackwood answered grimly. More importantly, it means the terrorist networks continue operating with the advantage of knowing our intelligence capabilities while we remain blind to the scope of their penetration. The stakes were becoming clearer with each new complication. This wasn't just about rescuing one intelligence asset. It was about protecting an entire intelligence infrastructure that had taken years to develop. Castellanos continued her equipment preparation while listening to the discussion, her movements reflecting the kind of professional focus that came from accepting impossible missions as routine. There's another factor we need to consider, she said without looking up from the communication device she was programming. If the convoy security is as extensive as the intercept suggests, it indicates they have intelligence about our capabilities that goes beyond normal operational security concerns. What does that imply for our mission planning? Major Thompson asked, though his expression suggested he was already beginning to understand the implications. It means they're not just protecting a valuable prisoner, Castellanos replied, finally looking up to meet the eyes of everyone in the room. They're specifically preparing to counter an American Special Operations rescue attempt, which suggests the security breach extends higher into our intelligence networks than we initially believed. The realization sent a chill through the assembled officers. The mission was becoming more critical and more dangerous with each new piece of intelligence, but it was also becoming the only opportunity to prevent a catastrophic intelligence disaster that could compromise American operations throughout the region. The helicopter lifted off from Andrews Air Force Base under cover of darkness, carrying Castellanos and a hastily assembled support team toward what had become the most critical intelligence operation in years. The modified timeline had compressed months of typical preparation into hours, and everyone aboard understood they were flying into a situation where improvisation would matter more than planning. Colonel Hayes, who had insisted on joining the operation despite his lack of special operations experience, studied the terrain maps by red-filtered light. The intercept point looks defensible, but only if we can establish position before the convoy arrives, he observed, his voice carrying the tension of someone operating outside his normal expertise. Defensible positions matter less than mobility in this type of operation, Castellanos replied, checking her equipment one final time. If the engagement lasts long enough to require defensive positions, we've already failed. The key is rapid execution and immediate extraction before enemy reinforcements can respond. Major Thompson, who had also volunteered for the mission, looked uncomfortable with the unconventional tactical approach. In conventional operations, we establish overwhelming superiority before engaging, he pointed out. This feels like we're deliberately accepting disadvantageous odds. That's exactly what we're doing, she confirmed without apparent concern. Task Force Amber operations succeed by avoiding conventional tactical thinking. The enemy expects us to wait for favorable conditions, so we strike when conditions appear unfavorable. It's counterintuitive, but it works. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets, announcing they were 20 minutes from the drop zone. General Blackwood, who was coordinating from the Pentagon, provided a final intelligence update through encrypted communications. The convoy left the compound 40 minutes ago, right on schedule. Satellite tracking shows 4 vehicles, exactly as predicted. Any changes to the security assessment? Castellanos asked, though her tone suggested she was prepared for whatever developments might have emerged during their flight. Negative changes, but we have confirmation of crew-served weapons on at least 2 escort vehicles, Blackwood's voice replied through the static. Also, communications intercepts suggest they're maintaining radio contact with a command element, which means response time for reinforcements could be shorter than we initially calculated. The news wasn't encouraging, but it wasn't entirely unexpected either. Hayes studied Castellanos' reaction, noting that she seemed to absorb each new complication with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout the day. How do you stay so composed when everything keeps getting worse? He asked with genuine curiosity. Because getting worse is normal, she replied simply. Every special operations mission faces complications that weren't anticipated during planning. The difference between success and failure is adapting to those complications rather than being paralyzed by them. Thompson checked his own equipment nervously, clearly struggling with the transition from conventional military operations to the improvisational approach that Castellanos represented. What happens if we can't extract the asset? Do we have contingency plans for mission failure? The question reflected the kind of detailed contingency planning that characterized conventional military operations, but Castellanos' response demonstrated a fundamentally different operational philosophy. Mission failure isn't a planning consideration for Task Force Amber operations, she said matter-of-factly. We plan to succeed regardless of complications, and we continue adapting until success is achieved. But surely you must have abort criteria, Hayes insisted. There have to be conditions under which the risk becomes unacceptable. The risk became unacceptable when we learned about the security breach, she replied. At this point, mission success is essential regardless of personal risk factors. The intelligence value of the asset and the need to contain the breach outweigh normal operational safety considerations. Her response highlighted the stakes involved and the level of commitment required for the type of operations she conducted routinely. The pilot announced they were approaching the drop zone, and the conversation shifted to final tactical preparations. Everyone aboard understood they were about to face a situation that would test capabilities most of them had never needed to develop. General Morrison's voice came through the communications system with updated positioning information. Satellite tracking shows the convoy is maintaining schedule and route. You should have approximately 30 minutes to establish position before they reach the intercept point. Understood, Castellanos acknowledged while conducting final equipment checks. Are extraction assets in position? The question reflected her focus on post-mission logistics, even while preparing for the immediate engagement. Extraction helicopters are staged at 2 locations along the probable egress routes, Morrison confirmed. But response time will depend on how quickly you can disengage after securing the asset. The helicopter began its descent toward the drop zone, and Castellanos shifted into the focused mental state that characterized her approach to high-risk operations. Hayes watched her transformation with fascination, noting how her entire demeanor became more concentrated and purposeful as the mission entered its execution phase. "This is it, gentlemen," she said as the aircraft touched down in a small clearing that would serve as their insertion point. "From this moment forward, we adapt to whatever we encounter, and we don't stop until the asset is secured and the mission is complete." The helicopter's rotors created a whirlwind of dust and debris as the 3-person team quickly disembarked with their equipment. Within seconds, the aircraft was lifting off again, leaving them alone in hostile territory with a mission timeline that allowed no margin for error. The silence that followed the helicopter's departure was profound, broken only by distant sounds that reminded them they were deep in enemy-controlled territory. Castellanos immediately began moving toward the intercept position, her navigation aided by GPS equipment that operated on frequencies unavailable to conventional forces. Hayes and Thompson followed, both struggling to match the pace she set through difficult terrain while carrying equipment loads they weren't accustomed to managing. The intercept point was a narrow valley where the convoy route passed between steep hills that would limit maneuverability and escape options for the vehicles. Castellanos had chosen the location during their flight based on satellite imagery and her understanding of tactical advantages that could offset their numerical disadvantage. 15 minutes to establish position and prepare for engagement, she announced as they reached the designated area. "Remember, the primary objective is securing the asset alive. Everything else is secondary to that goal." The convoy's approach was announced by the distant rumble of heavy vehicles navigating the mountain road, their engines echoing off the valley walls in a way that made precise distance calculation difficult. Castellanos lay motionless behind a rocky outcropping that provided both concealment and a clear field of fire, her breathing controlled and her focus absolute as years of training narrowed her awareness to the critical moments ahead. Hayes positioned himself 30 meters to her left, his conventional military training evident in his textbook positioning and equipment arrangement. Despite his inexperience with this type of operation, his steady nerve and professional competence provided reassurance that he would perform effectively when the engagement began. Thompson occupied the 3rd position, completing a triangle that would allow them to engage the convoy from multiple angles simultaneously. For vehicles, just as intelligence predicted, Castellanos whispered into her throat microphone as the convoy came into view around a bend in the mountain road. Lead and trail vehicles appear to be technical trucks with mounted weapons. Transport vehicle is second in line, armored but not heavily protected. 3rd vehicle looks like additional security personnel. The convoy moved with the careful precision of experienced security teams operating in hostile territory. Their spacing was professional, their speed calculated to balance movement efficiency with defensive capability. Watching them approach, Castellanos could see that these weren't typical militant fighters but trained military personnel who understood convoy security protocols. Hayes's voice came through her earpiece with barely controlled tension. "They're moving faster than we anticipated. Window for engagement is going to be shorter than planned." His observation reflected the reality that their carefully calculated timing was already being challenged by factors beyond their control. "Adapt to their speed, not our original timeline," she replied calmly. "We engage when the transport vehicle reaches the optimal position, regardless of how that affects our planned sequence. Mission success depends on flexibility, not rigid adherence to the original plan." The lead vehicle passed their position without detecting their presence, its mounted weapons scanning the surrounding terrain with professional thoroughness. The gunner was clearly experienced, his movements indicating familiarity with ambush tactics and counter-ambush procedures. This level of competence confirmed that the convoy security had been planned by people who understood American special operations capabilities. Transport vehicle approaching optimal engagement zone. Thompson reported from his position. Security posture suggests they're not aware of our presence, but their readiness level indicates they're prepared for contact. Castellanos watched the armored transport vehicle approach the precise point where the valley's terrain would limit its maneuverability while providing maximum advantage to their triangulated positions. Everything about this moment represented the culmination of months of intelligence work and years of operational preparation compressed into seconds of decisive action. "Engage on my mark," she whispered, her finger moving to the trigger of the specialized rifle that had been modified for exactly this type of precision engagement. Target the transport vehicle's engine block first, then focus on the escort vehicles. Priority is disabling mobility, not eliminating personnel unless absolutely necessary. The next few seconds unfolded with the crystalline clarity that characterized high-stress combat situations. The transport vehicle reached the optimal engagement point just as the trailing security vehicles entered the kill zone, creating a moment of perfect tactical alignment that would last only briefly before the convoy's movement carried them past the intercept opportunity. "Mark," she called softly, and 3 specialized weapons fired simultaneously with the precision that came from years of training and natural tactical instinct. The transport vehicle's engine block erupted in steam and smoke as her carefully aimed shot disabled the primary target. Hayes's shots found their mark on the lead security vehicle, while Thompson engaged the trailing escort with equal effectiveness. The convoy's response was immediate and professional, confirming that they were dealing with experienced military personnel rather than typical terrorist fighters. The disabled vehicles provided immediate cover for the security teams, who deployed with tactical discipline that spoke to extensive training and combat experience. Return fire began within seconds, forcing all 3 Americans to seek better cover positions. Transport vehicle is immobilized, but the asset's location within the vehicle is unknown, Castellanos reported while moving to a position that would allow her to approach the disabled transport. "Security teams are establishing defensive positions. We need to move quickly before they can coordinate an effective response." The engagement was developing exactly as she had anticipated, with professional enemy forces adapting to their attack while maintaining defensive discipline. Hayes and Thompson were providing effective suppressive fire that kept the security teams focused on immediate threats rather than organizing a coordinated counterattack. But the window for successful asset extraction was already beginning to close. Moving to secure the transport vehicle, she announced, beginning the most dangerous phase of the operation. The 30-meter approach to the disabled vehicle would expose her to fire from multiple positions, but it was the only way to determine the asset's condition and complete the primary mission objective. The sound of approaching helicopters added urgency to an already time-compressed situation. Whether they represented friendly extraction assets or enemy reinforcements wouldn't be clear until they were close enough to identify. But either way, their arrival would fundamentally change the tactical situation on the ground. Enemy reinforcements or friendly extraction, we need to accelerate the timeline, Hayes called out while maintaining suppressive fire on the security positions. The engagement window is collapsing faster than anticipated. Castellanos reached the transport vehicle and immediately began searching for the asset, while incoming fire forced her to work from a partially exposed position. The vehicle's interior had been modified for prisoner transport, with reinforced compartments that would protect the occupant during exactly this type of rescue attempt. Finding and extracting the asset would require more time than the tactical situation was likely to provide. "Asset located and conscious," she reported with relief. "Condition appears stable, but extraction from the vehicle will require cutting through reinforced restraints. Need additional time and cover fire." The helicopters were getting closer, their engine noise now clearly audible over the sound of ongoing gunfire. Thompson's voice carried new urgency as he provided tactical updates. Multiple aircraft approaching from the northeast. Cannot determine friendly or hostile intent from current position. Unknown aircraft complicate extraction timing significantly. Hayes added, while repositioning to maintain effective cover fire. If those are enemy reinforcements, our extraction window just became critical. Castellanos worked with practiced efficiency to free the asset from restraints that had been designed to prevent exactly this type of rescue attempt. The man was conscious but weakened by extended captivity, and his condition would affect their ability to move quickly during extraction. Every second of delay increased the risk that enemy reinforcements would arrive before they could successfully disengage. The asset spoke for the first time as Castellanos cut through the final restraint, his voice hoarse from captivity, but carrying urgent intelligence that changed everything about their understanding of the security breach. They know about the extraction, he whispered with desperate intensity. Someone in Washington has been feeding them information about our operations for months. Castellanos paused in her cutting work, the implications of his words hitting her like a physical blow. How much do they know? She asked while continuing to work on the restraints, her training allowing her to process critical intelligence while maintaining operational focus. Everything, he replied weakly. Communication protocols, operational timelines, even the identities of our field assets. The network penetration goes all the way to the Pentagon level. They've been 3 steps ahead of us for months. The revelation explained the military-level convoy security and the precision with which the enemy had anticipated their rescue attempt. Hayes's voice crackled through her earpiece with increasing urgency. Those helicopters are definitely hostile. Multiple aircraft, heavy weapons visible, and they're moving into attack formation. Time to move, Castellanos announced, finally freeing the asset from his restraints. The intelligence he'd provided was catastrophic, but their immediate survival depended on successful extraction before enemy air support could engage their positions. Can you move under your own power? She asked the weakened man. I can move, but not fast, he replied, struggling to sit up after weeks of captivity. His condition was better than she'd feared, but worse than their extraction timeline required. The approaching helicopters would reach engagement range within minutes, and moving through difficult terrain with a compromised asset would test their ability to reach the extraction point. Thompson's position came under heavy fire as the enemy security teams adjusted their defensive positions to account for the approaching air support. Taking heavy fire from multiple positions, he reported through gritted teeth. They're coordinating their ground forces with the incoming aircraft. Professional-level tactical coordination. The enemy's tactical sophistication confirmed what the asset had revealed about the extent of their intelligence penetration. They weren't just defending against a rescue attempt. They were executing a carefully planned counteroperation based on detailed knowledge of American special operations procedures. Moving to extraction point Alpha, Castellanos announced, while helping the asset begin the difficult journey through rocky terrain toward their designated helicopter landing zone. Hayes and Thompson would need to provide cover while falling back through carefully planned positions that would slow enemy pursuit without exposing them to concentrated fire. The first enemy helicopter appeared over the valley rim just as they began their withdrawal, its crew-served weapons immediately engaging their last known positions with devastating accuracy. The aircraft's tactical employment demonstrated professional military aviation rather than typical militant capabilities, confirming that they were facing organized military opposition. Air support is engaging our former positions, Hayes reported while moving through his planned withdrawal route. They're using coordinated fire patterns that suggest extensive training in counter-special operations procedures. This is an improvised resistance. Castellanos helped the asset navigate through terrain that would have been challenging for a healthy person, his weakened condition making every meter of progress a significant achievement. The extraction point was still 800 meters away through mountain terrain that offered limited concealment from aerial observation. The asset stumbled and nearly fell, his strength failing after the initial adrenaline of rescue began to fade. His physical condition was going to limit their movement speed, just when maximum mobility was essential for survival. We need to reach the extraction point before they can establish aerial surveillance over the entire valley, she told him while providing physical support. I'm trying, he gasped, clearly pushing himself beyond his current physical capabilities. But I need to know something else about the intelligence breach. The penetration includes real-time communication intercepts. They may be listening to our tactical communications right now. The possibility that their communications were compromised added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. Thompson's voice came through their earpieces with news that confirmed the asset's warning. Enemy forces are responding to our movements with precision that suggests real-time intelligence. They're anticipating our route selection. Switch to backup communication protocols, Castellanos ordered, while helping the asset continue their difficult progress toward the extraction point. From this point forward, assume all primary communications are compromised and operate under emission control procedures. The backup communication system would limit their ability to coordinate movements, but it was better than providing the enemy with real-time intelligence about their tactical decisions. Hayes acknowledged the switch while engaging enemy ground forces that were pursuing them with determination that spoke to the value they placed on preventing the asset's extraction. Enemy helicopters were now actively hunting them, using thermal imaging and coordinated search patterns that made concealment increasingly difficult. The aircraft's systematic approach to the search demonstrated familiarity with American extraction procedures and likely positions for helicopter landing zones. Extraction point is compromised, Thompson reported from his overwatch position. Enemy aircraft are establishing coverage over all probable landing zones. Our extraction assets won't be able to approach without engaging hostile air defense. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, but Castellanos had operated in similar circumstances during previous task force amber missions. Switch to extraction point Bravo, she decided, referring to an alternate location that would require additional travel time, but might avoid the enemy's aerial surveillance. The asset's breathing was becoming labored as they pushed through terrain that demanded more physical exertion than his current condition could easily provide. I don't know if I can make it to an alternate extraction point, he admitted with the honesty that came from understanding the stakes involved. You're going to make it because the intelligence you're carrying is critical to national security, she replied firmly, while adjusting her support to help him maintain forward movement. The enemy's intelligence penetration has to be stopped, and you're the only person who can provide the information necessary to identify and neutralize the breach. Enemy ground forces were closing the distance despite the covering fire that Hayes and Thompson were providing from successive defensive positions. The pursuit was being conducted with professional efficiency that suggested extensive training in tracking and pursuit operations against Special Forces teams. They're coordinating ground pursuit with aerial reconnaissance, Hayes reported while falling back to his next defensive position. Pursuit teams are using tactical movement that suggests they know our probable routes and defensive positions. The enemy's tactical competence was making extraction increasingly problematic, but Castellanos had survived similar situations by refusing to accept mission failure as an option. The asset's intelligence about the security breach made his successful extraction essential regardless of the personal risk involved. The satellite phone in Castellanos' tactical vest buzzed with an incoming encrypted call just as enemy helicopters began their final approach to the valley floor. She answered while maintaining her support of the weakened asset, recognizing the distinctive tone that indicated priority communication from the highest levels of command authority. Lieutenant Colonel, this is General Blackwood. We're tracking your situation through satellite surveillance. The voice carried controlled urgency that suggested developments beyond the immediate tactical situation. The president has been briefed on the intelligence breach, and this operation now has direct White House oversight. The revelation that presidential attention was focused on their mission added weight to an already critical situation, but it also suggested that resources might be available that hadn't existed during their original planning. What support can you provide? she asked while scanning the terrain for better defensive positions. We're scrambling additional extraction assets, but they won't reach your location for another 20 minutes, Blackwood replied. More importantly, we've identified the source of the intelligence leak. The information is going to change how you handle the asset's extraction. The asset looked up at her with alarm, clearly understanding that new intelligence about the security breach could affect his chances of survival. Who is it? He asked weakly, though his tone suggested he might already suspect the answer. The leak is coming from someone with access to National Security Council briefings. Blackwood's voice continued through the encrypted connection. We're not certain of the identity yet, but the position requires clearance levels that limit the suspect pool to fewer than 20 individuals. Castellanos processed this information while helping the asset navigate around a rocky outcropping that provided temporary concealment from aerial observation. The scope of the betrayal was even worse than they had feared, extending to the highest levels of national security decision-making. How long has this been going on? She asked. Based on operational analysis, possibly 3 years, Blackwood replied grimly. The enemy's tactical responses to your current situation suggest they have detailed knowledge of special operations procedures that could only come from someone with extensive access to classified operational planning. Thompson's voice interrupted through their backup communication system with news that made their desperate situation even more critical. Enemy ground forces have surrounded the alternate extraction point. They knew exactly where we were heading before we changed direction. The enemy's ability to anticipate their tactical decisions confirmed that the intelligence leak was providing real-time information about their operational planning. Hayes added his own tactical assessment from his defensive position. They're moving with precision that suggests they have access to our contingency planning. Every alternate route we've considered seems to be anticipated. The asset struggled to maintain the pace required for survival, his physical condition deteriorating under the stress of extended movement through difficult terrain. I need to tell you something else about the intelligence network, he gasped between labored breaths. The breach includes more than just operational planning. They have access to personnel files, family information, and personal security details for intelligence operatives. The implication sent a chill through Castellanos as she realized that the security breach extended to personal safety for intelligence personnel and their families. How extensive is their access to personnel information? She asked while scanning for enemy movement through the rocky terrain ahead. Complete access to personnel databases for anyone involved in Middle Eastern operations, he replied with the desperation of someone who understood the catastrophic scope of the betrayal. Names, addresses, family members, operational histories. They've been building target lists for potential elimination or compromise. General Blackwood's voice came through the satellite phone with updated intelligence that confirmed their worst fears. Lieutenant Colonel, we've detected suspicious activity around the homes of 3 task force Amber operatives. The security breach appears to include targeting information for active intelligence personnel. The personal stakes of the mission had just escalated beyond operational concerns to immediate threats against intelligence operatives and their families. Castellanos maintained her professional focus while processing the reality that her own identity and location were likely known to enemy forces. Enemy helicopters are establishing landing zones for additional ground forces, Thompson reported with controlled urgency. They're deploying what appears to be a full company of trained infantry. Our tactical situation is becoming untenable. The enemy's decision to commit significant military resources to preventing the asset's extraction demonstrated the intelligence value they placed on keeping him in their custody. Hayes provided additional tactical assessment from his observation position. Ground forces are moving with coordinated precision that suggests extensive training in counter-special operations procedures. Blackwood's voice carried new urgency as he provided updated support information. We have fast attack vehicles approaching your location, but they're still 15 minutes out. Can you maintain position and avoid capture for that duration? The question reflected the reality that their survival now depended on evading overwhelming enemy forces for a specific time period while protecting an asset whose physical condition limited mobility options. Castellanos evaluated their tactical situation with a cold assessment that characterized her approach to impossible circumstances. "We'll make it work," she replied with the confidence that came from years of succeeding under similar pressure. "But we need real-time intelligence about enemy troop movements to avoid their search patterns." The asset stumbled again, his strength failing under the physical demands of their desperate extraction attempt. His condition was becoming a limiting factor that could determine the success or failure of the entire operation. "I'm slowing you down," he acknowledged with the honesty that came from understanding tactical realities. "You're going to make it because the intelligence you're carrying is essential to protecting other operatives," she replied firmly, while adjusting her support to help him continue moving. "The enemy's access to personnel files makes your extraction critical to preventing attacks on intelligence families." Enemy ground forces were closing their search pattern, using systematic procedures that demonstrated professional military training and coordination. The sound of their movement through the rocky terrain indicated discipline and tactical competence that would make evasion increasingly difficult. "They're tightening the search perimeter," Hayes reported while repositioning to maintain observation of enemy movements. "Professional-level coordination suggests they're prepared for extended operations to prevent our extraction." The tactical situation required immediate decision-making about route selection and defensive positioning that would determine their survival chances. Castellanos studied the terrain ahead while calculating movement options that could keep them ahead of the search pattern long enough for extraction support to arrive. The sound of approaching fast attack vehicles cut through the valley air like salvation itself, their distinctive engine signatures announcing the arrival of extraction support that had seemed impossible just minutes earlier. Castellanos felt the asset's weight shift against her as he recognized the sound of American military equipment, his relief palpable despite their continued desperate circumstances. "Extraction assets are 2 minutes out," Blackwood's voice confirmed through the satellite phone. "But we have a problem. Satellite surveillance shows enemy forces have positioned anti-aircraft weapons at multiple points around the valley. Your extraction is going to be under fire from the moment our aircraft enter the engagement zone." The tactical reality was sobering, but not unexpected given the enemy's demonstrated capability and preparation. Thompson's voice came through their backup communications with confirmation of the threat assessment. "I can see at least 3 missile launcher positions from my current location. They've prepared this valley as a killing zone for helicopter extraction operations." Hayes added his own observations from his defensive position while maintaining suppressive fire against pursuing ground forces. Enemy infantry are establishing firing positions that will provide overlapping fields of fire against any landing zone in this valley. They've turned our extraction into their ambush. The enemy's tactical preparation demonstrated planning that went beyond opportunistic response to their rescue attempt. This level of preparation suggested advanced knowledge of American extraction procedures and probable landing zones. Castellanos helped the asset take cover behind a boulder formation while she assessed their increasingly limited options. The asset's breathing was labored, but his mind remained focused on the intelligence that made his extraction essential. "There's something else you need to know about the security breach," he said between gasps for air. "The leak isn't just providing operational intelligence. They're selling targeting information to terrorist organizations throughout the region." The revelation added another dimension to the catastrophic scope of the betrayal. Someone with access to the highest levels of American intelligence was actively facilitating terrorist operations against American personnel and interests. "How long has this been going on?" she asked while monitoring the approaching sounds of both friendly and enemy forces. "Based on what I learned during captivity, at least 18 months, he replied weakly. "The enemy showed me evidence of successful operations against our personnel that could only have succeeded with inside intelligence about their movements and security arrangements." The satellite phone buzzed again with priority communication from General Blackwood. "Lieutenant Colonel, we've identified the source of the leak. The information is going to shock you. It's Deputy National Security Advisor Richardson. He's been providing classified intelligence to foreign operatives for over 2 years. The name hit Castellanos like a physical blow. Richardson had been present at briefings where her operational assignments had been discussed, which meant her deep cover identity was likely compromised along with countless other intelligence operations. How extensive is the damage assessment? She asked while scanning for enemy movement through the rocks ahead. We're still calculating the scope, but preliminary analysis suggests dozens of operations have been compromised, Blackwood replied grimly. More importantly for your immediate situation, Richardson had access to contingency extraction plans for special operations in this region. The enemy knows exactly how we typically conduct helicopter extractions under these circumstances. The fast attack vehicles were now close enough that their tactical approach could be heard clearly, but enemy anti-aircraft positions were already tracking their movement with professional precision. Thompson provided tactical updates from his observation position. Enemy missile systems are acquiring targets on our extraction assets. The aircraft are flying directly into prepared ambush positions. Hayes confirmed the threat assessment while engaging enemy ground forces that were attempting to close their position. Multiple launcher positions with overlapping coverage of the entire valley floor. Our extraction aircraft won't be able to establish a safe landing zone under these conditions. The tactical situation had reached the critical point where conventional extraction procedures would result in the loss of aircraft and personnel without successfully completing the mission. Castellanos made the decision that years of special operations training had prepared her for. We're going to have to create our own extraction opportunity, she announced. What does that mean exactly? The asset asked, though his tone suggested he understood that conventional rescue procedures were no longer viable. It means we eliminate the anti-aircraft threat ourselves before the extraction aircraft enter the engagement zone, she replied, while checking her remaining ammunition and equipment. Thompson and Hayes will provide covering fire while I neutralize the missile positions. The plan was tactically sound but personally suicidal, requiring her to move across open terrain under fire to engage multiple prepared positions with limited ammunition and no backup support. Hayes understood the implications immediately. That's a one-way mission, he said flatly. The odds of surviving an assault on prepared positions are essentially zero. The odds of mission failure, if we don't eliminate those positions, are 100%, she replied with the calm acceptance that characterized her approach to impossible tactical situations. The asset's intelligence is critical to national security, and his extraction takes priority over individual survival considerations. Thompson's voice carried reluctant acknowledgement of tactical reality. She's right about the mission priorities, but there has to be another option. Can't the extraction aircraft engage the anti-aircraft positions with their own weapon systems? Not without exposing themselves to unacceptable losses. Blackwood's voice came through the satellite phone. The enemy positions are too well concealed and coordinated for effective engagement from aircraft. Ground assault is the only viable option for neutralizing the threat. The asset struggled to sit up straighter, his weakened condition evident but his determination clear. If someone has to make a sacrifice for this mission, it should be me, he said with quiet dignity. The intelligence I'm carrying can be transmitted through other channels if necessary. Negative, Castellanos replied firmly. Your personal testimony about the security breach is essential for prosecuting the traitor and repairing the intelligence damage. You're going home alive regardless of what it takes to make that happen. The sound of missile launches echoed through the valley as enemy forces engaged the approaching fast attack vehicles, confirming that the extraction was under fire exactly as anticipated. The aircraft were taking evasive action, but their ability to establish landing zones under fire was severely limited by the coordinated anti-aircraft threat. Extraction aircraft are under fire, but maintaining approach, Blackwood reported through increasingly static-filled communications. You have approximately 3 minutes before they reach the landing zone. Whatever you're going to do needs to happen now. Castellanos checked her equipment one final time while preparing for an assault that would determine the success or failure of the entire operation. The weight of national security implications pressed against her shoulders, but years of training had prepared her for exactly this type of decision point, where personal survival became secondary to mission completion. Castellanos began her assault on the first anti-aircraft position with a methodical precision that had kept her alive through 47 previous deep infiltration missions. Moving through terrain that offered minimal concealment, she used every boulder and depression to advance toward enemy positions that were focused on engaging the approaching extraction aircraft rather than defending against ground assault. The first missile launcher went silent after a precisely placed explosive charge eliminated both the weapon system and its crew. The enemy's response was immediate and professional, with remaining positions shifting their focus from aircraft engagement to locating and neutralizing the ground threat that had suddenly appeared in their defensive perimeter. 1 down, 2 remaining, she reported through a throat microphone while moving toward the second position under increasingly heavy fire. The enemy's tactical adaptation was swift and competent, but their surprise at facing ground assault provided her with brief windows of opportunity that years of training had taught her to exploit. Hayes and Thompson maintained covering fire that forced enemy infantry to seek cover rather than coordinating their response to her assault. Their suppressive fire was professional and effective, but both men understood they were providing support for what appeared to be a suicide mission against overwhelming odds. The second anti-aircraft position required a more direct approach through open terrain that exposed her to fire from multiple directions. Enemy forces had adapted to her presence and were coordinating their response with the tactical competence that characterized professional military units rather than typical terrorist fighters. Taking heavy fire but continuing assault on second position, she reported while maneuvering through enemy fire that was becoming increasingly accurate as their shooters adjusted to her movement patterns. The explosive charge she placed on the second launcher detonated just as enemy forces closed to within meters of her position. 2 down, 1 remaining. But my position is compromised, she announced while seeking cover from intensifying enemy fire. The third launcher position was the most challenging, requiring movement across completely open ground while under fire from coordinated enemy forces who now understood her tactical objective. The asset watched her desperate assault with the stunned realization that someone was willing to sacrifice their life to ensure his extraction. His weakened condition prevented him from providing any assistance, but his understanding of the stakes involved gave new meaning to the sacrifice being made on his behalf. General Blackwood's voice crackled through the satellite phone with urgent tactical updates. Extraction aircraft are 90 seconds out, but they need that final launcher eliminated before they can establish landing zone. His words carried the weight of understanding that Castellanos was conducting a mission with essentially no chance of personal survival. Final assault on third position, she announced while beginning her movement toward the last anti-aircraft launcher. Enemy fire was now concentrated and coordinated, forcing her to advance through a gauntlet of professional marksmen who understood exactly what she was attempting to accomplish. The approach to the third position required crossing 50 meters of open terrain under fire from multiple directions. Hayes and Thompson intensified their covering fire, but their ability to suppress an entire company of enemy infantry was limited by ammunition constraints and their own tactical positions. Approaching final position, she reported, her voice carrying the controlled calm that characterized her approach to impossible tactical situations. The explosive charge was ready, but reaching the launcher would require closing to within arm's length while under direct fire from its protective detail. The satellite phone buzzed with a new voice that stopped everyone in their tracks. Lieutenant Colonel Castellanos, this is the President of the United States. The voice carried unmistakable authority despite the static and interference. I'm personally monitoring this operation, and I want you to know that your sacrifice is not going unnoticed. The presidential intervention added weight to an already critical moment, but Castellanos maintained her tactical focus while preparing for the final assault. Mr. President, the mission will be completed regardless of personal cost, she replied while calculating her approach to the final launcher position. The enemy's defensive fire intensified as she began her final approach, but something unexpected happened that changed the tactical dynamic completely. The sound of additional helicopters filled the valley air, and within seconds, precision airstrikes began eliminating enemy positions with devastating accuracy. Fast attack vehicles have been joined by Apache attack helicopters, Blackwood's voice announced with barely controlled excitement. The president authorized direct military engagement to support your extraction. You now have close air support eliminating remaining threats. The tactical situation transformed within minutes as professional military air power systematically eliminated enemy positions that had seemed insurmountable just moments before. Castellanos reached the final launcher position to find it abandoned, its crew eliminated by precision helicopter strikes that had arrived at the perfect moment. All anti-aircraft threats neutralized, she reported while moving back toward the asset's position. Extraction zone is clear for helicopter landing. The mission that had seemed impossible was suddenly achievable through the intervention of resources that existed outside normal special operations parameters. The extraction helicopter touched down in the valley with rotors spinning, its crew providing covering fire, while Hayes and Thompson helped the weakened asset move toward the aircraft. Castellanos provided final security while ensuring that no enemy forces remained capable of threatening the extraction. Asset secured and ready for extraction, she announced while boarding the helicopter that represented salvation after what had seemed like certain death. The intelligence he's carrying will prevent further security breaches and protect other operatives from compromise. As the helicopter lifted off from the valley floor, General Blackwood's voice came through their communications with news that completed the mission's success. Richardson has been arrested, and we're conducting damage assessment on all operations he may have compromised. Your extraction of the asset provided the final evidence necessary for prosecution. The asset, despite his weakened condition, managed to speak during their flight to safety. "What you did today saved more than just my life," he said with quiet gratitude. The intelligence breach was going to result in the deaths of dozens of operatives and their families. Your willingness to sacrifice everything prevented a catastrophic intelligence disaster. 3 weeks later, Castellanos sat in a Pentagon briefing room that was remarkably similar to the one where her morning had begun with dismissal and skepticism. But now the same officers who had questioned her qualifications were present to witness her receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom for preventing what intelligence analysts had determined would have been the worst security breach in American history. General Blackwood, whose skepticism had been so apparent during their first meeting, now spoke with genuine respect and admiration. Lieutenant Colonel Castellanos represents the finest traditions of American special operations, he announced to the assembled officers. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for mission success prevented a catastrophic intelligence disaster. The transformation in how she was perceived was complete, but more importantly, the security breach had been contained and the traitor neutralized. Colonel Hayes, Major Thompson, and General Morrison now understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, and their previous assumptions about capabilities and qualifications had been permanently changed. If this story moved you, drop a comment about what resonated most with you, or share if you've witnessed similar courage and hidden strength in real life. Sometimes the most capable people are the ones whose true abilities remain hidden until the moment when everything depends on their willingness to sacrifice for something greater than themselves.